Have you ever wondered what it truly meant to lose yourself in another time? To slip away from the bright screens and endless notifications of our modern world and drift into the shadowed corners of a medieval tavern? Tonight, we're going to explore a life that history rarely remembers, the quiet tragedy of those who found both refuge and ruin in the dim, smoky warmth of the alehouse. What drove someone to spend their days in the company of strangers, their nights blurred by weak ale and flickering candlelight? What did it feel like to wake each morning knowing that your path would lead inevitably back to that same worn wooden table? That same circle of familiar faces marked by stories half remembered and dreams long abandoned. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's strangely comforting to see how many of us are drifting off together from different corners of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, and let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. We're traveling back to England in the late 14th century, to a small market town where cobblestone streets glisten with recent rain, and the warm glow of tavern windows promises shelter from the cold. Here in these forgotten corners of the medieval world, we'll walk alongside someone whose life was shaped not by grand battles or royal decrees, but by the simple, relentless rhythm of need, comfort, and the search for belonging in a world that offered little mercy to those who stumbled. Close your eyes, let the sounds of our modern world fade away, and step with me into the dim, ale-scented warmth of a tavern where time moved slowly and where every day began with the weight of yesterday's choices. The first sensation that greets you each morning is not the gentle warmth of sunlight through glass windows, but the damp chill of stone walls and the scratchy press of straw against your cheek. Your mouth feels as though it's been filled with wool left too long in the rain, dry, bitter, with the sour residue of last night's ale coating your tongue like a film you cannot wash away. You are somewhere between sleep and waking, in that uncertain space where the body refuses to fully commit to either state. Perhaps you're in the narrow chamber above the tavern, where you've managed to secure a corner of straw bedding for a few precious copper coins. Or perhaps you're curled against the back wall of the alehouse itself, where the heat from the kitchen hearth seeps through the stones, just enough to keep the frost from settling on your clothes. The air around you carries the mingled scents of your world, wood smoke that has seeped into every fiber of your garments, the yeasty sweetness of ale that seems to rise from the very floorboards below, and that particular mustiness of wool that has been worn too long, washed to seldom, and holds within its weave the accumulated dampness of countless English mornings. Imagine yourself there, in that moment between night and day, feeling the way your joints protest as you shift against the straw. Your back aches from sleeping on surfaces that offer no comfort, and there's that familiar throb behind your temples, not quite pain, but the body's quiet reminder of yesterday's indulgences. Your hands, feel them now, rough from whatever work you could find. Fingernails permanently darkened with dirt that seems to resist even the most vigorous scrubbing in the tavern-esque wash basin. The rhythm of your days begins not with purpose, but with assessment. You reach instinctively for the small leather pouch at your waist, fingers counting coins without looking, a habit born of necessity. 3 copper pennies, perhaps 4 if fortune smiled yesterday. Enough for ale, but not for ale and bread. Enough for warmth and forgetting, but not for both comfort and sustenance. This is the mathematics of survival, calculated fresh each morning in the dim light that filters through oiled parchment windows. Outside, you can hear the town beginning to stir. The clip-clop of horses on cobblestones, the creak of cartwheels, the distant call of a merchant announcing his wares. But these sounds feel muffled, separated from your world by more than just walls. Separated by the invisible barrier between those who move through life with direction and those who simply endure it. Day by day, drink by drink, you rise slowly, feeling the way the cold has settled into your bones overnight. Your clothes, a patched tunic of rough wool, hose that have seen too many amendments, boots whose leather has softened beyond proper support, hang on your frame like the costume of a play you never auditioned for but somehow find yourself performing every day. The descent to the main hall of the tavern is a small journey in itself, so wooden stairs that creak with familiar voices, each plank knowing the weight and rhythm of your footsteps. The air grows warmer as you approach the common room, but also thicker, heavy with the ghosts of last night's gathering. Smoke hangs like a gentle fog, never quite clearing, as though the tavern exists in its own perpetual twilight. And there it is, your table. Not officially yours, of course, but claimed through the simple persistence of presence. A scarred oak surface worn smooth by countless elbows, marked with ring stains from tankards, set down with varying degrees of care. The bench beside it bears the impression of your form, a shallow depression that speaks of hours spent in patient waiting. In quiet observation, in the slow consumption of ale that stretches each penny as far as it will go, the tavern keeper, a man whose name you know, but whose friendship remains just beyond your grasp, acknowledges your arrival with the slightest nod. There's no hostility in his expression, but no warmth either. Just the professional recognition of someone who pays what he can, when he can, and who has never been the source of serious trouble. Behind him, on a slate board darkened with use, your name appears in chalk alongside a sum that grows larger with disturbing regularity. 4 shillings, 6 pence. A number that might as well be written in a foreign language for all the hope you have of clearing it. The morning ale arrives without being ordered, weak brown stuff that tastes more of water than barley, but carries within it the promise of warmth and the gentle blunting of edges that have grown too sharp overnight. You wrap your fingers around the pewter tankard, feeling the cool metal slowly warm to match your body's temperature, and take that first sip. It's not pleasure, exactly, but relief. The kind that comes when a familiar comfort returns to chase away the uncertain territory of sobriety. Around you, the tavern begins to fill with the day's early patrons. Merchants pause to break their fast before continuing their journeys. Local craftsmen meeting to discuss work or settle debts. Farmers' wives gather to exchange news and gossip before the day's responsibilities claim them. You are part of this community, yet separate from it, a fixture they expect to find here, but not quite a participant in their more purposeful lives. The conversations flow around you like water around a stone. Talk of crop yields and market prices, of marriages being arranged and disputes being settled. Occasionally, someone will include you with a nod or a question about some piece of local knowledge. You've been here long enough to become something of an informal chronicle of the town's small happenings. But mostly you observe, nursing your ale and letting the warmth of the room settle into your bones. By mid-morning, the first wave of patrons has departed for their various enterprises, leaving the tavern to settle into its quieter rhythm. This is when the day's real challenge begins, the search for enough coins to ensure that tomorrow will look much like today. Work, when it can be found, comes in small portions. Perhaps the brewer needs help moving barrels from cellar to cart. Perhaps a merchant requires assistance loading wool bundles for transport. Perhaps there are messages to be carried between the tavern and the market square. The labor is never consistent, never enough to build toward something larger. Instead, it exists in the eternal present of immediate need. Your back grows sore from lifting loads that younger, stronger men handle with ease. Your hands develop new calluses that layer over old ones, creating a map of small struggles written on your palms. The work pays in copper coins that seem to grow lighter each year, buying less bread, securing shorter stays in rented corners. Imagine the weight of that inconsistency, the way uncertainty becomes its own kind of fatigue. You never know if today will bring enough work to afford both drink and shelter, or if you'll find yourself choosing between the comfort of ale and the necessity of walls. The tavern represents both sanctuary and trap, a place where you're accepted for what you are, but where what you are slowly consumes whatever you might have become. The afternoon brings different challenges. The sun, when it appears through England's perpetual blanket of clouds, seems to illuminate everything you'd rather keep in shadow. The patches on your clothes become more obvious. The tremor in your hands when they're not wrapped around a tankard becomes harder to disguise. The gap between your life and the lives of those who move through the tavern with purpose becomes a chasm you can almost see. This is when the ale serves not just as comfort, but as necessity. It softens the sharp edges of comparison, blurs the too clear distinctions between success and failure, between those who belong fully in the world and those who exist in its margins. Each sip is a small retreat from the harsh accounting that sobriety demands. The barmaid, a woman whose name is Mary or Margaret, though you've never been quite certain, moves through the room with practiced efficiency. She knows your habits well enough to anticipate your needs, but there's a careful distance in her kindness. She's seen too many like you to invest much hope in transformation. But she's human enough to offer small mercies. a bowl of pottage when your coin runs short, a seat near the hearth on particularly cold days, news of work that might suit your particular limitations. Her smile, when she offers it, is genuine but guarded. You represent both familiarity and warning, a reminder of how thin the line is between those who drink for pleasure and those who drink for survival. She's kind to you in the way one is kind to an old dog who still wags its tail but whose best days are visibly behind him. Evening approaches with the same inevitability as dawn, and with it comes the tavern's transformation from place of business to place of refuge. The rush lights are lit, casting their warm, unsteady glow across faces that seem softer in the flickering light. The ale flows more freely, conversation grows louder and more animated, and for a few precious hours, the weight of individual circumstance lifts into something approaching communal warmth. This is your time, the hours when your presence at the familiar table becomes not just accepted but somehow necessary. You are part of the tavern's evening ritual, a constant in the midst of change. New faces appear and disappear, but you remain, offering the comfort of continuity to others who seek their own temporary escape from the demanding clarity of daytime responsibility. The stories begin to flow as freely as the drink. Tales of distant markets and strange customs, of nobility glimpsed from afar, of weather and wages and the small dramas that give shape to ordinary lives. You contribute what you can, memories of seasons past, knowledge of local customs, the kind of accumulated wisdom that comes from watching the same small world turn through its cycles year after year. But even in these moments of warmth and inclusion, you can feel the fundamental difference between your relationship to this place and that of those around you. For them, the tavern is an interruption in their regular lives, a place to pause before returning to homes and families and enterprises that give meaning to their days. For you, this is not an interruption but the main text, the primary relationship that gives structure to time's passage. As the evening deepens and the last customers settle their debts and make their way home, you face the same choice that ends every day. Do you have enough coin for both a final drink and a place to sleep? The mathematics are simple, but the emotional calculation is more complex. The drink offers immediate comfort and the postponement of tomorrow's worries. The bed offers rest, but rest often brings dreams you'd rather avoid. And the morning always arrives with its harsh accounting of needs unmet and hopes deferred. More often than not, the final drink wins. The coin changes hands with familiar ritual, and you settle back into your corner, letting the ale work its gentle magic of transformation. The tavern grows quieter but never silent. The fire continues to crackle. Late drinkers murmur in low conversation. Somewhere in the kitchen, pots are cleaned and prepared for tomorrow's service. This is how your days end, not with dramatic conclusion, but with gentle fading. You are not so much falling asleep as falling away, letting consciousness release its grip on a day that was neither triumph nor disaster, but simply another revolution in the slow wheel of survival. Around you, the tavern breathes with its own quiet rhythm, and you breathe with it. Part of something larger than yourself, but smaller than the world that waits beyond these familiar walls. The night settles over the town like a worn blanket, muffling sound and softening edges. Outside, honest folks sleep in their beds, tomorrow's plans already taking shape in their dreams. But here, in the dim warmth of the tavern, time moves differently. Here, the future is measured not in seasons or years, but in the distance between one drink and the next. One day, and the day that will inevitably follow. Tomorrow will bring the same choices, the same small struggles, the same calculations of need against resources. But tonight, wrapped in the tavern's forgiving shadows, warmed by ale and the presence of others who understand the particular weight of living without grand ambition, you're exactly where you belong. Not happy, perhaps, but at home in the only way available to you. The rhythm of your days continues, steady as a heartbeat, quiet as breathing, marking time in a world that has forgotten how to hurry toward anything that might disappoint. This is the life you've chosen, or perhaps the life that has chosen you. Either way, it is yours. And in the gentle haze of evening ale that seems, for now, enough. As the evening settles deeper into the tavern's familiar rhythms, let us drift from the general experience of tavern life to the particular story of one man whose name has echoed through the local records, whispered in the corners of this very room for generations. They called him Will of the Broken Tankard, though his true surname was Carpenter. A name that carried the ghost of ambitions his hands never quite managed to fulfill. William Carpenter was born in this same market town on a February morning, when frost painted delicate ferns across the inside of shuttered windows. The year was 1347, and the world he entered was already marked by the shadow of change. His father, Thomas, worked the thatch trade, climbing onto roofs with bundles of straw and red, weaving weather-tight coverings that would shelter families through England's long, damp seasons. His mother, Agnes, took in washing for the town's more prosperous families, her hands growing red and rough in the cold water of the river, wringing cleanliness from cloth that carried the stories of other people's lives. Picture young Will in those early years, when possibility still seemed to stretch before him like an unwalked path. He was a slight boy with quick eyes and an ear for melody, the kind of child who could repeat a song after hearing it once, who could make even the gloomiest adult smile with his effortless mimicry of the traveling minstrels who sometimes graced the tavern with their performances. There was something in him that seemed to catch light, a natural charm that made people want to press a copper coin into his palm, to ruffle his hair and predict great things for his future. But charm, as Will would learn, is a currency that loses value with age. And the skills that delight in a child can seem hollow when they're all a man has to offer the world. His father tried to teach him the thatcher's trade, showing him how to select the best reeds, how to layer them so that rain would run away rather than seep through. But Will's hands, though clever with a lute string or quick to sketch amusing faces in the dirt, seemed to lack the particular patience the thatching required. The work was methodical, repetitive, demanding a kind of steady attention that his restless spirit couldn't quite settle into. Instead, he found himself drawn to the tavern, initially as messenger and occasional entertainer. The tavern keeper in those days was a man named Aldrich, who had a soft spot for Will's easy manner and quick wit. Young Will could carry messages between the tavern and the market with reliability, could charm difficult customers out of their anger, could keep a room entertained during the long, dark hours of winter evenings with songs learned from passing travelers, and stories that seemed to grow more elaborate with each telling. For a few golden years, this seemed like enough. Will had found his place in the world, not quite a minstrel, not quite a servant, but something in between that suited his particular talents. He had a small room above the tavern, regular meals, and the kind of respect that comes from being genuinely useful. The townspeople knew him, liked him, counted him as part of the community's fabric. On feast days, he would organize entertainments. During harvest season, he would sing the old songs that were said to bless the grain. When traveling merchants needed someone trustworthy to guide them to lodgings or help with their business in town, Will was often recommended. But the winter of 1369 brought changes that would alter the course of his life in ways he couldn't foresee. The harvest had been poor that year, not disastrously so, but enough to make every household count their stores more carefully. Trade slowed, and with it, the flow of travelers through the tavern. Aldrich, facing his own financial pressures, could no longer afford to keep Will in regular employment. The comfortable arrangement that had sustained them both dissolved, not in anger or disappointment, but in the quiet arithmetic of survival that governs so many lives. Will found himself at 22, adrift in a world that suddenly seemed less welcoming. The skills that had served him well in prosperity, his ability to entertain, to charm, to make himself agreeable, seemed less valuable when people were focused on more immediate necessities. He took what work he could find, helping farmers with their livestock, carrying messages between villages, assisting the local smith with simple tasks that required more back than brain. It was during this uncertain time that his relationship with ale began to deepen beyond mere social drinking. Initially, it was simply a way to stretch limited resources. A tankard of weak beer could serve as both meal and comfort on days when proper food was beyond his reach. The tavern, while no longer his workplace, remained his most natural community. He knew everyone there, understood the rhythms and customs, felt accepted in a way that the wider world no longer seemed to offer. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the balance shifted. Where once he had drunk for pleasure and companionship, he found himself drinking for comfort, then for necessity, then for the simple postponement of problems that seemed to grow more complex with each sober examination. The charm that had once opened doors began to work against him, as people started to see his easy manner not as natural charisma, but as the practiced performance of someone trying to hide deeper troubles. The incident that earned him his nickname happened on a particularly cold January. Evening in 1372. Will had been drinking steadily since midday, celebrating a small payment received for helping a merchant inventory his goods. As the evening wore on, and the tavern filled with its usual collection of locals and travelers, a discussion arose about the relative merits of different ales brewed in the region. Will, feeling expansive and authoritative, began to hold forth on the subject with the confidence that only comes from extensive personal research. But somewhere in his elaborate discourse on barley and hops, on brewing techniques and seasonal variations, he gestured too broadly with his tankard. The pewter vessel, already showing wear from years of use, struck the edge of the wooden table with just enough force to crack along a seam that had been weakened by countless washings and refillings. Ale splashed across the table, soaking into the wood and dripping onto the floor, while Will stared at the two pieces of what had been his drinking vessel with the kind of profound dismay that only makes sense to someone who has just destroyed one of the few things they could call their own. The tavern erupted in laughter, not cruel, but genuinely amused by the dramatic conclusion to Will's lecture on ales. Someone called out, "There's Will of the Broken Tankard," and the name stuck with the persistence that only the most perfectly apt nicknames possess. Even Will himself came to embrace it, understanding that in a world where so many people were defined by their failures rather than their ambitions, there was a kind of honest dignity in owning the moment when luck and clumsiness conspired to make him memorable. The years that followed saw Will settle into a pattern that would define the remainder of his life. He never again had steady employment, but he developed a reputation for reliability in small tasks. Merchants knew they could trust him to deliver messages or guide strangers to their destinations. Farmers would hire him during harvest season for work that required familiarity with the region rather than specialized skill. The tavern keeper, Aldrich's son now, would occasionally employ him to sweep floors or stoke fires in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. But these arrangements were always temporary, always subject to the changing needs and resources of others. Will's life became a series of small accommodations and minor arrangements, a continuous negotiation with circumstance that required constant attention and adaptation. The energy that this lifestyle demanded, the need to always be alert for opportunity, to always be prepared to charm or convince or cajole his way into the next meal, the next warm place to sleep, was exhausting in ways that more settled people rarely understood. The ale that had once been simply part of his social world became increasingly central to his coping with this exhaustion. It offered not just comfort, but a kind of temporary escape from the relentless calculations of survival. In the gentle haze of drink, the future seemed less pressing, the past less disappointing, and the present more tolerable. The tavern, where his credit was still good when he had occasional earnings to apply against it, became not just his primary social world, but his refuge from all the worlds where he didn't quite fit. There were good times scattered through these years, moments when everything seemed to align in Will's favor, particularly successful harvest season when work was plentiful and well paid. A winter when a wealthy merchant took a liking to his stories and kept him employed for months as a kind of informal entertainer. Spring festivals when his natural charm and knowledge of traditional songs made him briefly indispensable to the town's celebrations. But these periods of relative prosperity were always followed by stretches of uncertainty that seemed to last longer and cut deeper each time. Will would emerge from weeks or months of steady work and regular meals, only to find that his tolerance for ale had increased, that his body had grown accustomed to levels of consumption that quickly ate through whatever savings he had managed to accumulate. The townspeople watched this slow decline with the mixture of affection and resignation that communities develop for members who are loved but cannot be saved. Will remained genuinely likable. His humor became sharper with experience, his stories more elaborate, his understanding of human nature more nuanced. But he also became increasingly predictable in ways that made people protective of their own resources and opportunities. By his 40th birthday, a milestone that passed without particular celebration or even clear acknowledgement, Will had become something of a local institution. New residents would be introduced to him as part of learning about the town's character. Children would be warned not to follow his example, while simultaneously being entertained by his willingness to perform small tricks or tell silly stories for their amusement. Visitors would be told about Will of the Broken Tankard as an example of local color, a harmless eccentric who added flavor to the tavern's atmosphere. But Will himself experienced this institutionalization as a kind of gentle imprisonment. He understood that he had become a cautionary tale, a person whose life served as a warning to others about the dangers of certain choices. This knowledge didn't make him bitter, exactly, but it added a layer of self-awareness to his drinking that made the escape it offered less complete than it had once been. The physical toll of his lifestyle became increasingly difficult to ignore. His hands developed a tremor that made simple tasks more challenging. His stomach grew sensitive to the rough foods that were often all he could afford. His sleep became fitful, interrupted by dreams he couldn't quite remember. But that left him feeling more tired upon waking than when he had closed his eyes. The winters seemed colder, the summers more oppressive, and the simple act of moving through each day required more effort than it once had. Yet there were still moments of genuine contentment scattered through these difficulties. Evening gatherings in the tavern, when conversation flowed easily, and Will found himself at the center of a group that appreciated his stories and insights. Quiet mornings when he would wake without the usual headache and step outside to find the town bathed in particularly beautiful light. Interactions with travelers who didn't know his history and responded to him simply as an interesting local character, rather than as someone whose life choices required explanation or judgment. It was during one such interaction that Will experienced what might have been his last moment of true happiness. A merchant from London, delayed in town by a lame horse, spent several evenings in the tavern, listening to Will's stories about the region's history and customs. The merchant was educated and well-traveled, but he seemed genuinely interested in Will's perspective on local life and folklore. For those few evenings, Will felt himself seen not as a failure or a warning, but as someone with valuable knowledge and insights to share. The merchant, upon departing, pressed a silver coin into Will's palm, not charity, but payment for services genuinely appreciated. "You've made my stay here memorable," he said, "and taught me things I wouldn't have learned any other way." For weeks afterward, Will would turn that coin over in his fingers, not spending it, but keeping it as evidence that his life had, at least once, been genuinely useful to someone who had no obligation to pretend otherwise. But silver coins, like golden moments, cannot be hoarded indefinitely. Eventually, a particularly harsh week, when no work could be found and no credit remained anywhere in town, Will exchanged the coin for enough ale to last several days. As he watched the silver disappear into the tavern keeper's strongbox, he felt something inside himself settle into a kind of final acceptance. This was who he was. This was the life he had built through countless small choices, and there was a kind of peace to be found in no longer fighting against its limitations. The final years of Will's life were marked not by dramatic decline, but by a gradual fading, like a song played softer and softer until it blends into silence. He continued to haunt his familiar corners of the tavern, continued to find occasional work and regular companionship, continued to be tolerated and even loved by a community that had long since accepted his limitations as part of his character. But the energy that had once made him genuinely entertaining began to ebb, replaced by a quieter presence that people found comforting in its predictability. He died as he had lived his final years, quietly, without drama or particular notice. One winter morning, the tavern keeper found him at his usual table, head resting on his arms as though he had simply decided to take a brief nap. There was no sign of distress or struggle, no evidence of pain or fear. He had simply stopped, like a clock whose spring had finally unwound. In the place where he had found whatever peace was available to him, the town buried Will of the broken tankard in the churchyard, though his grave bore only his Christian name and the year of his death. But his memory lived on in the tavern he had called home, in the stories that were told about him, in the gentle warning his life provided to others who might be tempted down similar paths. He had been, in his way, exactly what he appeared to be, neither hero nor villain, but simply a man who had tried to find a place for himself in a world that offered limited options for people of his particular talents and limitations. And perhaps, in the end, that was enough. Perhaps the warmth of the tavern, the companionship of others who understood the weight of imperfect lives, the small pleasures that could be found in ale and stories and the comfort of familiar routines. Perhaps these things constituted a kind of success that cannot be measured by the standards typically applied to human achievement. Perhaps Will of the broken tankard had found exactly the life he was meant to live, and lived it with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. The tavern still stands, and on quiet evenings when the light falls just so across the old oak tables, regulars sometimes claim they can still feel his presence, not as ghost or spirit, but as the lingering warmth of someone who had loved this place well and been loved by it in return, despite all his human frailties and the limitations they imposed upon his dreams. As we drift deeper into the night, shadows lengthening across worn wooden floors and candlelight flickering against stone walls that have witnessed centuries of human gathering, let us turn our attention from Will's particular story to something even more elusive. The echoes of voices that once filled these ancient tavern walls with melodies that now exist only in fragments, in half-remembered phrases whispered by the wind, and the faint impressions left by songs that time has almost entirely claimed, like footprints on a beach at high tide. The very air within these establishments seems to vibrate still with the ghost of music, as if the stones themselves have absorbed the countless nights of harmony and held them close, releasing them now only in the quietest moments when the modern world grows still enough to listen. These were not mere drinking establishments, but sacred spaces of a different sort. Temples to human fellowship, where the communion wine was ale, and the liturgy was laughter punctuated by song. Close your eyes and imagine, if you will, the sound of 20 voices raised together on a winter evening when frost painted. Intricate patterns on diamond-paned windows and the warmth inside felt like a bulwark against the cold darkness of the medieval world. Picture rough hands wrapped around clay cups, weathered faces illuminated by the dancing flames of the central hearth, and voices. Voices that had called to livestock in dawn fields, bargained in market squares, whispered prayers in candlelit churches, now joining together in melodies that made perfect sense to their singers, but would sound like ancient riddles to our modern ears, encrypted messages from a world we can barely comprehend. These were not the grand ballads of noble courts with their tales of chivalrous knights and impossible quests, nor the sacred hymns of cathedral choirs with their Latin phrases and celestial harmonies, but something altogether more intimate and precious. The working songs of ordinary people who gathered in smoky rooms thick with the scent of ale and wood smoke, seeking to find in shared melody and rhythm a temporary escape from the relentless weight of their daily struggles against poverty, disease, and the countless small indignities that defined medieval existence for all but the most privileged. The songs they sang were born from their lives, melodies that spoke of harvests good and bad, of loves found and lost, of the peculiar fellowship that emerges when people who have little else can still share the wealth of their voices. These melodies were not performed but lived, not presented but participated in, creating a democracy of music where the baker's voice might blend with the blacksmith's, where the tavern keeper's wife might harmonize with a passing merchant, where for the duration of a song, social hierarchies dissolved into something more fundamental, the basic human need to make beauty together. Archaeologists and historians, those patient detectives of the past who sift through centuries of accumulated silence, have spent decades searching for traces of this lost musical world with the dedication of treasure hunters, seeking not gold, but something far more valuable, the sound of human joy preserved across the centuries. They work like archaeologists of sound itself, carefully excavating layers of time, not with trowels and brushes, but with magnifying glasses and infrared photography. Sifting through monastery archives where monks recorded their daily bread alongside glimpses of secular wonder. Examining legal documents where scribes sometimes revealed more than they intended about the world beyond their official duties. Their tools are patience and intuition. The ability to read between lines, written by hands that have been dust for 500 years. They search through inventories of household goods, looking for mentions of musical instruments. Through court records seeking references to songs deemed inappropriate or seditious. Through the margins of manuscripts where bored scribes sometimes scribbled forbidden verses like schoolchildren defying their teachers. They analyze the wear patterns on ancient tavern tables, where countless hands once beat time to rhythms we can no longer hear. Study the acoustic properties of medieval buildings to understand how music might have sounded within those spaces. Examine the wine stains and burn marks on old documents that suggest where they might have been when music filled the air around them. What they have discovered is tantalizing in its incompleteness. Like finding a single page from a book whose other chapters have been scattered to the winds, each fragment they uncover raises more questions than it answers. Each clue leads to dead ends that stretch across centuries of silence. The evidence exists, but it exists in pieces so small and scattered that reconstructing the whole seems almost impossible. like trying to rebuild a symphony from a handful of notes hummed by someone who heard it once, long ago on a night they can barely remember. In the archives of St. Bartholomew's Monastery, tucked between 2 pages of accounts for grain purchases, mundane records of barley and wheat, of sacks weighed and silver counted, a scholar with tired eyes and infinite patience found 4 lines written in a hasty hand. The ink faded to brown, but still legible after 6 centuries. When barley gold fills up the horn, and winter's breath grows sharp and cold, let no man drink his ale alone, for lonely cups make hearts grow old. For lines, that is all that remains of what was once, perhaps, a song of many verses. A complete musical story that might have taken 10 minutes to sing in its entirety, that might have been known by heart by hundreds of people across several generations. The melody that gave these words their wings has vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving only the faint ghost of rhythm that poets feel when reading verse aloud, the suggestion of music that lives in the spaces between words, in the natural rise and fall of syllables that hint at how voices might once have shaped them into something greater than mere speech. Modern scholars have tried to reconstruct what the complete song might have sounded like. It's working with musicologists and folklorists to create melodies that might fit the meter and mood of the surviving verses. But their attempts, however scholarly and well-intentioned, feel hollow and artificial, clean and self-conscious, missing whatever rough magic made these particular words worth preserving in the first place. They lack the spontaneity of creation, the sense of a song emerging naturally from the circumstances that created it, shaped by the voices that first sang it and polished by countless repetitions until every note felt inevitable. The very survival of these 4 lines raises questions that may never be answered. Why did someone write them down when the culture of tavern songs was so thoroughly oral? What circumstances led a monastery scribe to risk, including secular, drinking-related material in what was supposed to be a religious document? Is this an act of rebellion, nostalgia, or simple momentary distraction? Imagine the monk who wrote those lines in the margin of his ledger, squill scratching against parchment in the flickering light of an oil lamp, while winter wind rattled the shutters of his cell. Perhaps he was young, recently arrived at the monastery from a world where such songs were as common as breathing, where every gathering of more than 2 people seemed to spontaneously generate music. Perhaps his family had been tavern keepers, or perhaps he had simply grown up in a village where the distinction between secular and sacred music was less rigid than his new religious community preferred. Picture him on that particular evening, as he tallied sacks of grain and calculated the costs of bread for the coming month, his mind wandering from the practical mathematics of monastery life to memories of voices singing together in warm rooms that smelled of hops and humanity. Perhaps the cold stone walls around him seemed suddenly too quiet, too empty of the kind of music that made hardship bearable. Perhaps the memory of community singing became too strong to ignore, and his quill, moving almost without conscious direction, captured those 4 precious lines before the moment passed and his attention returned to holier matters, to the endless cycle of prayer and work and meditation that defined his new existence. What was the rest of that song? How many verses did it contain, and what stories did they tell? Was it sung slowly, like a lament for the passing of warm seasons and easy companionship, or with the quick, infectious rhythm of celebration, voices tumbling over each other in their eagerness to reach the chorus? Did it have a refrain that everyone knew by heart, words so familiar that even the drunkest patron could join in without missing a beat? Or was it the kind of song that grew and changed with each telling, shaped by the particular needs and memories of each night's gathering, evolving like a living thing that adapted to its environment? These questions hang in the air like incense, sweet with possibility, but ultimately unanswerable. Reminders that some aspects of human experience resist preservation, no matter how desperately we wish to recover them. The song exists now only as potential energy, as mito bins that tease us with their proximity to meaning. The mystery deepens when we consider the drinking horn mentioned in those rescued verses, an object that connects the song to a whole material culture of medieval drinking that we can partially reconstruct through archaeological evidence. Archaeologists have found dozens of such horns throughout medieval England, scattered across centuries and social classes. Some plain and practical, carved from common cattle horns, and finished with simple leather bindings, decorated with intricate silver bands that catch the light like frozen music. etched with patterns that speak of craft traditions passed down through generations of metalworkers. Each horn tells its own story through the marks left by use, the smooth polish of lips that touch the rim thousands of times, the slight wear patterns that show how hands preferred to hold them, the stains and scratches that speak of countless nights when they were passed from person to person, carrying not just ale but the fellowship that made drinking a communal act rather than a solitary one. In a field near Gloucester, farmer's plow turned up a horn that had been buried for so long that the earth around it had turned dark, with the organic compounds leached from its surface. When archaeologists carefully excavated it, they found it was still stained with something that might once have been ale, its interior polished to a mere smoothness by centuries of use that ended abruptly when it was either lost or deliberately buried. Perhaps during one of the periodic upheavals that marked medieval life, plague, war, or religious persecution that scattered communities and lost their possessions to time. When Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the archaeologist who led the excavation, first held that ancient horn to her ear in the laboratory where it was being studied and preserved, she swore she could detect the faintest echo of ancient laughter. A sound so subtle it might have been imagination, but persistent enough that she mentioned it in her field notes. Her colleagues, trained in the rigorous skepticism that scientific method demands, attributed this to the wind moving through the horn's natural curves, creating tiny variations in air pressure that the ear might interpret as sound. But perhaps Dr. Thornfield was not entirely wrong, and perhaps her colleagues were not entirely right. Perhaps objects that have witnessed great joy do retain some memory of the experiences they have hosted, some quantum echo of the emotions they have absorbed over decades of use. Perhaps that horn passed from hand to hand on countless evenings, had absorbed something of the warmth and fellowship it helped to create, something that even 6 centuries of burial could not entirely erase. The idea is not as far-fetched as it might seem. Modern physics tells us that information cannot be destroyed, only transformed. And every interaction between matter and energy leaves traces that persist in ways we are only beginning to understand. If consciousness can affect quantum states, if observation can change the fundamental nature of reality at the subatomic level, then perhaps the focused attention and emotional energy of hundreds of people using the same object might indeed leave impressions that sensitive individuals can detect. Whether or not such impressions exist in any measurable sense, they certainly exist in the realm of human meaning. That horn, like every artifact recovered from the medieval world, carries with it the weight of all the lives it touched, all the moments it helped to create. When we hold such objects or study them in museums, we are not just examining ancient technology, but connecting across centuries to the fundamental human experiences that unite us with people who lived and died long before we were born. The search for lost tavern songs has led researchers down fascinating paths that wind through archives and excavation sites, through linguistic analysis and acoustic archaeology, through the patient work of scholars who spend their careers pursuing questions that may never be fully answered. Their investigations reveal not just the existence of musical traditions we have lost, but the complex social and political forces that led to their disappearance. In the town records of a small village in Yorkshire, preserved by accident in a monastery library when the original town hall burned down in the 16th century, researchers found mention of a fine imposed on 3 men for singing lewd verses in the manner of drunkards. During the feast of St. Michael in the year 1387, the fine was substantial. 3 shillings, enough to buy a good sheep or feed a family for a week, suggesting that the authorities took such infractions seriously. The 3 men presumably paid their fine and were chastened by the experience, warned against repeating their offense, and perhaps grateful to escape with only financial punishment. When other forms of correction were available to medieval justice, but nowhere in the records, despite their otherwise meticulous detail, is there any indication of what those lewd verses actually contained. Were they simply crude humor of the kind that has always flourished in places where alcohol loosens tongues and inhibitions? Harmless if vulgar entertainment that gave people permission to laugh at bodily functions and sexual situations that polite society preferred to ignore? Or were they something more complex and potentially dangerous? Satirical songs that used humor as a weapon to comment on local politics, social tensions, or the behavior of prominent citizens who preferred not to be the subjects of public mockery. The distinction matters because it reveals something important about the power that tavern songs wielded. In medieval society, the authorities concerned with such songs, their willingness to impose significant financial penalties for singing them, suggests they carried influence far beyond mere entertainment. In an age when most people could not read, when information traveled slowly and was carefully controlled by those in power, songs served as vehicles for news, gossip, and social commentary that could spread through a community faster than any official proclamation. A clever verse that mocked a corrupt official's habit of skimming from tax collections, or a hypocritical merchant's practice of using false weights, or a priest's fondness for the tavern keeper's daughter, could travel from village to village, carried by traveling tinkers and wandering minstrels, repeated and embellished until it became part of the collective memory of everyone who heard it. Such songs shaped public opinion with the irresistible force of a memorable melody, creating consensus about social issues in ways that formal political processes could not match. The authorities understood this power and worked systematically to control it, but their efforts to suppress certain songs have ensured that we know they existed, even if we cannot recover their content. The legal records, the official complaints, the fines and punishments, all of these create a negative space around the missing songs, defining them by their absence like shadows that reveal the shape of objects we cannot directly see. This dynamic between official culture and popular expression created a constant tension that we can trace through medieval records. On one side, the church and secular authorities promoted approved forms of music, hymns that reinforced religious doctrine, ballads that celebrated noble deeds, work songs that encouraged productivity without questioning social arrangements. On the other side, ordinary people created and preserved songs that addressed their own concerns, celebrated their own values, and sometimes directly challenged the authority of their supposed betters. The tavern became a crucial space in this cultural negotiation, a semi-public environment where people could gather in large enough numbers to create a community, but small enough groups to maintain some privacy from official surveillance. The songs that emerged from these spaces represented a form of cultural democracy, created collectively and preserved through participation rather than written authority. Consider the mystery of what scholars have come to call the harvest song fragments, discovered not through systematic searching, but through the kind of serendipitous connection-making that drives the best historical research. In 3 different locations, it's a church in Devon where restoration work revealed writing hidden behind later additions, a manor house in Kent where graffiti was found carved into a window alcove, and a merchant's ledger in Norfolk where someone had used the margins for purposes far removed from commerce. Researchers have found nearly identical phrases that seem to belong to the same lost song. The phrases speak of golden grain dancing in the wind like angel's hair, and the reaper's reward that fills both belly and heart. But they are embedded in documents that have nothing to do with agriculture or seasonal celebration. One appears in the margin of a book of prayers, written in the same hand that copied out Psalms and written in ink that matches the official text, suggesting that whoever wrote it had both access to expensive materials and the skill to use them properly. Another is scratched into the oak beam of a great hall, crude letters carved with a knife or sharp stone, suggesting someone with different social status and different tools but the same familiarity with the song's language. The third is written on the back of a bill of sale for wool, in the quick, practical script of someone accustomed to keeping records, someone who wrote these words while conducting business, but whose mind had wandered to older melodies. The geographical spread is as significant as the textual consistency. Devon to Kent and Norfolk represents a triangle covering much of southern England, distances that would have taken days or weeks to travel in the medieval period. The fact that the same specific phrases appear across such a wide area, written by different hands in different decades, suggests they were part of a song so widely known that people quoted it naturally, without thinking the way modern people might hum advertising jingles or reference movie lines. But if the song was so popular, so deeply embedded in the culture that fragments of it appeared spontaneously across hundreds of miles and several generations, why has no complete version survived? Why do we have only these tantalizing pieces, like shards from a broken pot that hint at the shape and beauty of the original, but can never be reassembled into wholeness? The answer may lie in the very nature of tavern culture itself. These songs were meant to be sung, not written, their existence tied to the physical act of voices joining together in shared rhythm and melody. They lived in memory and breath, in the communal experience of making music together. In the way individual voices blended and separated, supported and challenged each other, creating harmonies that existed only for the duration of the performance and could never be exactly repeated. Writing them down would have been like trying to capture smoke in a bottle, or preserve the sound of laughter in a jar. The songs existed as living phenomena, shaped by the acoustics of the rooms where they were sung, by the number and quality of voices available on any given night, by the mood and circumstances that brought people together. They were collaborative creations that belonged to everyone and no one, changing slightly with each performance as singers forgot words or added new verses or adjusted melodies to suit their own vocal ranges. This oral tradition created songs that were remarkably resilient, able to survive decades or centuries through human memory alone, but also vulnerable to complete disappearance if the chain of transmission was broken. A song might be known by heart by dozens of people in a community, but if those people died in a plague outbreak, or were scattered by war, or simply moved away and found themselves in places where different songs were preferred, the musical knowledge they carried could vanish as completely as if it had never existed. Recent archaeological work has uncovered another piece of this puzzle, a discovery that illustrates both the fragility and the persistence of medieval musical culture. During restoration of a 14th century tavern that still operates in the Cotswolds, a building that has served alcohol continuously for more than 600 years, making it one of England's oldest licensed premises. Workers removing old plaster from a wall discovered something extraordinary hidden beneath layers of paint and grime, applied by generations of renovators who had no idea what they were covering. Scratched into the original oak timber, barely visible until the right light struck it at the proper angle and revealed the ancient marks like a photograph emerging in a dark room, were musical notations of a type that scholars had seen before, but never in such a context. These were not the elaborate illuminated manuscripts created by professional scribes in monastery workshops, nor the formal compositions written for noble courts, but something much rarer and more precious. Actual musical notation from the tavern itself. Evidence that someone who drank and sang within those walls cared enough about preserving a melody to risk damaging someone else's property. The notations are crude by the standards of formal musical composition. Clearly not the work of someone trained in the official traditions of musical notation that were developing during the medieval period. The lines waver slightly, as if carved by someone whose hand was not entirely steady, whether from alcohol, emotion, or simple unfamiliarity with the tools needed for such precise work. But they represent something invaluable, direct physical evidence that the people who gathered in medieval taverns thought of themselves as musicians worthy of preservation, that they believed their songs mattered enough to be remembered beyond the nights when they were first created. The notations suggest a song in a minor key with a lilting rhythm that rises and falls like conversation itself, like the natural cadences of speech when people are relaxed and happy and not trying to impress anyone with formal eloquence. The melody appears to be structured in 4-bar phrases that repeat with variations, the kind of pattern that makes a song easy to remember and easy to sing along with, even for people who have never heard it before. Modern musicians and musicologists have attempted to flesh out this skeletal melody, using their knowledge of medieval musical theory and their understanding of folk traditions to create full arrangements that might approximate what the song originally sounded like. They have consulted surviving examples of medieval music from other sources, studied the acoustic properties of the tavern where the notation was found, even experimented with period instruments to try to recreate the sound palette that would have been available to the song's original performers, but their interpretations, however scholarly and well-researched, remain speculation rather than reconstruction. The soul of the song, whatever combination of words, melody, harmony, and human emotion made it worth carving into oak in the first place, remains as elusive as ever. The notation preserves the skeleton but not the flesh, the structure but not the spirit that once animated it. This gap between evidence and experience points to one of the fundamental challenges facing anyone who tries to understand the musical culture of the medieval period. We can recover fragments, we can make educated guesses, we can create reasonable approximations based on surviving evidence from related contexts. But the essential element, the live performance, the interaction between singers and audience, the way individual voices blended together to create something greater than the sum of their parts, cannot be recovered because it was never preserved in any form that transcends its original moment. The mystery extends beyond individual songs to entire musical traditions that seem to have vanished without trace, leaving behind only references and descriptions that tantalize us with their incompleteness. Chronicles from the period mention ale-blessing songs that were supposed to ensure a successful brewing, magical formulas disguised as entertainment that brewers sang over their vats to encourage fermentation or ward off the evil influences that could turn good ingredients into undrinkable swill. These songs apparently combine practical advice about brewing techniques with supernatural beliefs about the spirits that governed fermentation, creating a body of musical knowledge that was both pragmatic and mystical. A successful brewer was expected to know not just the proper proportions of malt and hops, but also the proper melodies to sing during different stages of the process. Songs that help pass the long hours of waiting and watching, while also invoking whatever divine or natural forces might influence the outcome. Similarly, the records speak of harvest home melodies that celebrated the completion of seasonal agricultural work, songs that marked the transition from the anxious period of growing and tending to the relief of gathering and storing. These were not just celebrations, but ritual acknowledgments of the community effort required for survival. Musical ceremonies that transformed individual labor into collective achievement and private anxiety into shared joy. There were also travelers' tales set to music, narrative songs that helped pass long winter evenings. When darkness fell early and there was little work that could be done by candlelight or firelight, these musical stories served multiple functions. They entertained people during the boring stretches of the medieval year. They preserved historical and cultural information that might otherwise be forgotten, and they created a sense of connection to the wider world beyond the immediate community. But if written versions of these songs ever existed, they have not survived the centuries that separate us from their creation. Either they were never recorded in the first place, existing only in the minds and voices of the people who performed them, or the documents that contained them have been lost to fire, flood, war, or simple neglect. Victims of the countless disasters that have claimed so much of the medieval documentary record, some scholars believe the loss was not accidental, but intentional, the result of systematic efforts to suppress aspects of popular culture that were deemed inappropriate or dangerous by authorities who preferred more controlled forms of expression. As the medieval period gave way to more modern sensibilities, as the church's influence grew stronger, and popular culture came under increasing scrutiny from both religious and secular officials, there may have been deliberate campaigns to eliminate the more earthy and irreverent aspects of tavern life. Songs that celebrated drinking, that mocked authority figures, that dealt frankly with human desires and bodily functions, that included magical or superstitious elements that contradicted official Christian doctrine. The same forces that led to the destruction of medieval mystery plays, the suppression of folk festivals, and the closing of many traditional alehouses may also have contributed to the disappearance of the songs that once filled these spaces with music. But even this explanation raises more questions than it answers, because the process of cultural change is never as simple or complete as it might appear from a distance of centuries. If there were systematic efforts to destroy tavern songs, why do we still have fragments like the ones discovered in monastery archives and carved into tavern timbers? Why do references to such music continue to appear in records throughout the medieval period and even into the Renaissance? Why does the archaeological evidence suggest that taverns continued to be centers of musical activity even as official culture moved in different directions? The answer may be that these songs were too deeply embedded in the fabric of ordinary life to eliminate entirely, like weeds that grow back no matter how thoroughly they are uprooted, like streams that find new channels when their original courses are blocked. These melodies may have survived in altered forms, disguised as children's games, work songs, or even religious hymns that preserved ancient melodic structures while adapting them to new purposes and new words. This process of musical evolution and adaptation means that some of the songs we are seeking may not actually be lost, but transformed, hidden in plain sight within the folk traditions that have continued to evolve down to the present day. The children's round that modern schoolchildren sing in playgrounds may preserve a melody that once accompanied the brewing of ale in a medieval tavern. The work song that agricultural laborers used to coordinate their efforts during harvest may carry within its structure the ghost of ancient harvest home celebrations. The hymn that congregations sing in modern churches may have been built on melodic foundations that were laid down centuries ago in secular contexts that would shock contemporary worshippers. This possibility has led to some of the most interesting research in medieval music studies, as scholars work backward from surviving traditions to try to identify elements that might have ancient origins. The search for lost tavern music has led to some surprising discoveries that suggest the boundaries between sacred and secular, between high culture and popular entertainment, were much more permeable in the medieval period than later generations assumed. A team of researchers analyzing the structure of traditional English folk songs using computer-assisted pattern recognition found rhythmic and melodic elements that appear to be much older than the earliest written versions of the songs, suggesting that many of them may indeed have descended from medieval drinking songs. The repetitive choruses that make such songs easy to sing for groups of people, the irregular verse structures that allow for improvisation and adaptation, the tendency to tell stories through accumulated detail rather than linear narrative, all of these characteristics match what we might expect from songs designed to be performed by groups of people whose attention and coordination were somewhat impaired by alcohol, but whose enthusiasm for music remained undiminished. More intriguingly, analysis of the linguistic patterns in these folk songs reveals layers of vocabulary and grammar that correspond to different historical periods, like geological strata, that preserve evidence of ancient environments. Some verses use words and phrases that were common in the 14th century, but obsolete by the 16th, while others show the influence of later periods when the songs were adapted to changing tastes and circumstances. The result is a palimpsest of cultural history. Songs that carry within their structure the accumulated changes of centuries while preserving, at their core, something that may be genuinely medieval. There is something both frustrating and beautiful about these fragments and theories. These glimpses of a musical world that once existed as surely as the stones of the taverns where it flourished, but which now survives only in pieces so small that we can barely make out the shape of the whole. It reminds us that history is not just the story of kings and battles, laws and treaties, the grand narratives that fill textbooks and museum displays, but also of ordinary people creating beauty and meaning in the midst of their daily struggles against hardship, uncertainty, and the countless small disappointments that make up most human experience. Those lost songs represent thousands of evenings when people gathered together in smoky rooms that smelled of ale and wood smoke, when they transformed the simple act of drinking into something approaching art, something that lifted the spirit even as it relaxed the body. They represent moments when social barriers dissolved in the democracy of shared music, when the baker and the blacksmith discovered they could harmonize, when the merchant's wife and the farmer's daughter found their voices blending in ways that created something neither could achieve alone. Perhaps the mystery itself is part of the song's enduring power and significance. By remaining incomplete, by refusing to be fully recovered and cataloged and explained, they preserve something of the magic they once possessed, the sense of discovery and spontaneity that made them living cultural phenomena rather than museum pieces. They exist now, as they may have existed then, as possibilities rather than certainties, as invitations to imagination rather than commands to attention, as reminders that some of the most important human experiences resist preservation, because they can only be lived, never captured. In the quiet moments between sleep and waking, when the boundary between past and present grows thin and permeable, when consciousness drifts between dream and memory, perhaps we can still hear echoes of those lost melodies threading through the silence, perhaps in the sound of wind moving through old timber that remembers the vibrations of ancient voices, in the distant hum of conversation from other rooms that carries the same rhythms humans have always used when they gather together, in the gentle pulse of our own breathing as we settle into rest and our hearts slow to match the eternal rhythms that connect us to everyone who has ever lived and died. We catch fragments of songs that once filled the night air with human warmth and fellowship. The tavern songs may be lost to us, their melodies scattered like leaves in an autumn wind, their words forgotten like the names of most people who sang them. But the need they served remains as constant as hunger or thirst or the desire for shelter. We still gather together to share stories and laughter, to find comfort in each other's company, to create moments of beauty and connection that help us bear the weight of existence in a world that often seems indifferent to human hopes and dreams. The forms change with each generation. The settings evolve to match new technologies and social arrangements. But the fundamental human impulse to sing together, to raise our voices in shared expression of hope and sorrow and simple companionship, continues as it has for millennia. In every karaoke bar and church choir, in every stadium crowd singing along with their team's anthem, in every group of friends harmonizing around a campfire, we see the same impulse that once filled medieval taverns with music. So as you drift toward sleep, imagine those voices rising together in the warm, smoky air of a medieval tavern, voices that belong to two people whose names we will never know but whose need for music and fellowship we share across the centuries. Imagine songs that celebrated the small victories and acknowledged the quiet defeats that make up most human lives. Melodies that transformed ordinary evenings into something memorable and meaningful. That turned strangers into companions and companions into friends. If only for the duration of a song that might last 3 minutes, but whose effects could echo in memory for years. The words may be lost, scattered by time like ashes in the wind. The tunes may be forgotten, their melodies dissolved back into the silence from which they came. But the spirit that created them lives on in every gathering where people choose connection over isolation, where they risk the vulnerability of shared expression, where they trust that their voices, however imperfect, are worth raising together into the night air that surrounds us all, the same air that once carried the songs of medieval drinkers and will someday carry the songs of generations yet to be born. In this continuity of human music making, in this endless chain of voices raised in fellowship, the lost tavern songs find their truest preservation. They live not in the fragments scholars recover or the melodies musicians reconstruct, but in the eternal human impulse to transform silence into song, solitude into community, ordinary moments into occasions for beauty. Every time people gather to make music together, something of those ancient tavern songs is reborn, not in identical form, but an essential spirit, carrying forward the gift our ancestors gave us, the knowledge that we need not face the darkness alone, that our voices joined together can create light as our night journey draws toward its gentle conclusion. Let us step away from the familiar warmth of the tavern and drift, like smoke rising from the hearth, toward a very different kind of gathering. Just a few miles from where Will of the Broken Tankard spent his evenings nursing weak ale, picture yourself moving through the cool night air, past fields where tenant farmers sleep in their simple beds, past the stone boundaries that mark the beginning of the Lord's domain. The manor house rises before you like a ship of light in an ocean of darkness, its great hall illuminated by what seems like 100 candles, their warm glow revealing glimpses of a world that operates by entirely different rules than those that govern the tavern we have just left behind. Through the tall windows, you can see the long trestle tables that stretch the length of the hall. Their surface is covered not with the rough planks and stained wood of the alehouse, but with fine linen cloths that gleam white as fresh snow in the candlelight. Silver goblets catch and reflect the flames, creating points of dancing light that seem to multiply the brightness of the room. The very air shimmers with a richness that speaks of abundance, of resources gathered from across the Lord's extensive holdings and brought together for this evening's display of hospitality and power. The Lord himself sits at the high table, elevated both literally and symbolically above his guests. He is a man in his middle years, his face bearing the confident ease of someone who has never questioned his right to occupy the finest chair, to be served the choicest portions, to speak and expect to be heard with attention and respect. His clothing, a robe of deep blue wool trimmed with fur, a belt worked with silver threads, rings that catch the candlelight with every gesture, represents more wealth than Will of the Broken Tankard would see in several lifetimes. But observe how he drinks, and notice the differences that privilege creates. The goblet that touches his lips is filled not with the thin, sour ale that serves as sustenance for the tavern's patrons, but with wine imported from distant vineyards, rich, complex liquids that have been aged in oak barrels and transported across dangerous roads at considerable expense. When he drinks, It is not from necessity or for the blunting of sharp edges, but as an expression of refined taste, a display of access to pleasures that geography and politics have placed beyond the reach of ordinary people. The wine steward, a man whose sole responsibility is understanding and serving these precious liquids, moves between the tables with practiced grace. He knows not just which wine complements each course of the meal, but also the preferences of individual guests. The subtle hierarchies that determine who receives the finest vintages and who must content themselves with lesser offerings. His knowledge represents a form of education that exists nowhere in the tavern world. Learning devoted entirely to the enhancement of pleasure rather than the simple satisfaction of basic needs. Around the high table, the Lord's family and honored guests participate in conversations that would seem foreign to the practical discussions that fill the alehouse. They speak of distant events, of politics in London and Paris, of marriages being negotiated between great houses, of the complex web of obligations and loyalties that bind the nobility together across vast distances. Their concerns exist on a scale that makes the tavern's focus on local harvests and market prices seem quaint, almost childlike in its immediate simplicity. The lady of the manor, resplendent in silk that rustles softly with each movement, raises her goblet to acknowledge a toast proposed by a visiting knight. The wine she drinks is sweetened with honey and spiced with imports from the east. Cinnamon and cloves that represent wealth, not just in their cost, but in the exotic journeys they have completed to reach this table. She drinks slowly, delicately, in sips that are measured not by need but by the rhythms of social ritual and the maintenance of feminine grace. Watch how differently intoxication manifests in this elevated world. Where tavern drinking leads to slurred speech and unsteady movement, the nobility's relationship with alcohol follows more sophisticated patterns. They may consume quantities that would fell a common laborer, but their intoxication expresses itself in heightened wit, in philosophical discourse that grows more elaborate as the evening progresses, in gestures that become more theatrical without losing their essential elegance. The entertainment that accompanies their drinking reflects these same distinctions. Instead of Will's rough stories and half-remembered songs, the great hall is filled with the skilled performance of professional musicians, and trained from childhood in the complex art of courtly music, whose instruments are crafted from the finest materials by master artisans. Their songs tell not of local gossip or seasonal struggles, but of legendary heroes, distant lands, and the idealized romance that the nobility wishes to see reflected in its own image. A troubadour, his lute inlaid with mother-of-pearl that gleams in the candlelight, sings of a knight's devotion to his lady, of quests undertaken in the name of love, of loyalty that transcends death itself. The melody is complex, sophisticated, designed to showcase both the performer's skill and the audience's refined taste. This is music as art rather than as simple companionship, entertainment that elevates rather than merely comforts. The food that accompanies this drinking represents another world entirely from the rough bread and thin stew that might sustain a tavern evening. Whole roasted peacocks, their feathers carefully preserved and replaced after cooking to create a display that is as much visual art as nourishment. Elaborate pastries shaped like castles and cathedrals, their construction requiring skills passed down through generations of specialized cooks. Dishes seasoned with spices worth more than a craftsman's annual income. Preparations that transform basic ingredients into complex symphonies of flavor. Yet observe, too, how even in this world of abundance, alcohol serves some of the same functions it serves in humbler settings. The wine loosens tongues, encouraging confidences and revelations that sobriety might keep carefully guarded. Political alliances are forged over shared goblets. Business arrangements discussed with the kind of frank honesty that only comes when formality has been gently dissolved by drink. Even here, among people whose daily lives are insulated from immediate material want, there is the same human need for connection, for the temporary suspension of the barriers that separate individual consciousness from communal warmth. But the safety net that catches the nobility when they stumble is woven from entirely different materials than anything available in the tavern world. When a lord drinks too much, servants appear to assist him to chambers furnished with feather beds and silk hangings. When his judgment is impaired by wine, stewards and advisors step forward to handle the details of administration. When morning brings the inevitable reckoning with excess, Physicians trained in the universities of Paris and Bologna stand ready with remedies, compounded from exotic ingredients and ancient knowledge. This is perhaps the most profound difference between the two worlds, not just in the quality of what is consumed, but in the consequences of consumption. Tavern drunk who spends his last coin on ale faces hunger and cold. A noble who empties his wine cellar in a single night of entertainment merely signals his steward to purchase more from distant merchants who compete for the privilege of supplying such a wealthy household. The physical spaces themselves tell the story of these different relationships to drink. The tavern's low ceilings and small windows create an atmosphere of intimacy and enclosure, a refuge from the harsh realities of the world outside. The great hall soars upward into shadowy rafters, its high windows and expansive floor plan speaking of a different kind of power, the ability to gather large numbers of people, to display wealth on a grand scale, to create environments that inspire awe rather than comfort. Even the vessels from which they drink reflect these distinctions. The pewter tankards of the tavern, sturdy and practical, designed to withstand rough handling and frequent washing, bear the dents and scratches of hard use. The silver goblets of the great hall gleam with the perfection of objects that are handled with reverence, cleaned with special care, stored in locked cupboards when not in use. They are not just containers but symbols, physical manifestations of the social order that places some people permanently above others. The conversations that flow around these different drinking vessels follow patterns that mirror their physical surroundings. In the tavern, talk tends toward the immediate and practical, the price of grain, the behavior of neighbors, the small dramas that give shape to local life. Around the high table, discourse ranges across vast territories of learning and speculation, theological questions that have occupied scholars for centuries, reports from travelers who have seen distant lands, plans that will affect the lives of hundreds of people across multiple seasons. Yet there are moments when the barriers between these worlds seem to grow thin, when the fundamental humanity that underlies all drinking customs reveals itself regardless of setting. A young squire, newly arrived at court and still remembering the simpler pleasures of his father's modest hall, finds himself homesick, despite the splendor that surrounds him. An aging knight, his joints aching with old wounds, drinks not for pleasure, but for the same kind of pain relief that might drive a laborer to seek comfort in ale. The Lord himself, for all his power and privilege, sometimes stares into his wine goblet with the same expression of weary contemplation that crosses the face of any drinker who has lived long enough to understand life's essential loneliness. These moments of recognition across the divide of social class are perhaps the most poignant aspects of the evening's entertainment. They remind us that beneath the elaborate costumes and complex rituals, the same basic human needs and fears motivate both the tavern drunk and the noble lord. Both seek community, both fear isolation, both use alcohol as a bridge between the solitary self and the social world that gives meaning to individual existence. As the evening progresses and the wine continues to flow, the distinctions between the two worlds become both more pronounced and more blurred. The noble's intoxication allows him liberties that would be scandalous if attempted while sober. Familiar conversation with servants, boisterous laughter that echoes through chambers usually reserved for more dignified discourse, gestures of affection toward companions that protocol normally keeps at careful distance, yet even in his cups, remains insulated by privilege from the kinds of consequences that would befall a common man guilty of similar behavior. The servants who clean up after these festivities, who sweep away the remnants of abundance and restore order to chaos, often come from the same social world as the tavern's patrons. For them, the great feast represents not participation, but observation. A glimpse into a realm of possibilities so distant from their own experience that it might as well exist in another country. They handle the silver goblets with careful respect, knowing that a single piece represents more wealth than they will accumulate in years of labor, yet they too will eventually make their way to their own modest celebrations. Their own gatherings where drink serves the same essential functions it serves everywhere human beings congregate. Perhaps they will gather in the kitchen after the Lord's guests have departed, sharing the remnants of the feast and a jug of the ordinary wine reserved for household staff. Perhaps they will visit the village tavern on their next free evening, carrying with them stories of the grand entertainment they have witnessed. Tales that will be told and retold until they become part of the local folklore. The contrast between these two worlds, the tavern with its honest poverty and the great hall with its abundant privilege, speaks to something fundamental about human nature and social organization. Both represent attempts to create meaning and community through shared consumption, shared ritual, shared participation in customs that connect individual lives to larger patterns of cultural significance. The forms may differ dramatically, but the underlying needs they address remain remarkably constant across all levels of society. As the manor house settles into the quiet hours before dawn, as the last guests find their way to chambers prepared with luxury that would seem impossible to those sleeping on tavern straw. The distance between these two worlds seems both infinite and insignificant. Infinite, because the material differences are so vast that they create entirely different ways of experiencing existence. Insignificant, because the fundamental human experiences they represent. The need for connection, the desire for pleasure, the search for meaning in the midst of life's essential uncertainty, unite all people regardless of their position in the social hierarchy. Both Will of the Broken Tankard and the Lord of the Manor will wake tomorrow to face the consequences of their evening's choices. Both will need to navigate the delicate balance between individual desire and social obligation. Both will continue to seek in their own ways and within their own limitations some accommodation with a world that offers more questions than answers, more complexity than any single life can fully comprehend. The wine and the ale, the silver goblet and the pewter tankard, the great hall and the humble tavern, all are simply different instruments for playing the same essential human song. The melody of people trying to find their place in a world larger and stranger than any individual can ever fully understand. And so we reach the end of our quiet journey through these shadowed corners of the medieval world. Having walked alongside those whose lives were shaped by the simple rhythms of need and comfort, of community found in unlikely places, of human connection forged in the warm, smoky air of gathering places that existed long before our modern world, learn to measure time in minutes and success in accumulated possessions. As you settle deeper into the comfort of your own bed, surrounded by the conveniences and securities that centuries of human effort have built for us, take a moment to feel the vast distance we have traveled together tonight. The cold that Will felt, seeping through the gaps in his clothes. The uncertainty that marked each morning's awakening. The way hunger could make simple decisions impossibly complex. These experiences belong to a world so removed from our own that they seem almost mythological in their strangeness. Yet somehow, in exploring that world, we have touched something that remains fundamentally familiar. The need for belonging that drew people to those dim, smoky rooms. The search for stories that would help make sense of the confusion and difficulty of being human. The desire for rituals and customs that could transform ordinary evenings into something approaching celebration. Something that lifted the spirit even when circumstances offered little cause for joy. Think of Will of the Broken Tankard, settling into his familiar corner as the evening drew toward its close, surrounded by the gentle noise of conversation and the warm light of rushlights that pushed back the darkness for a few precious hours. His life, with all its limitations and disappointments, contained moments of genuine contentment, intervals of peace when the tavern felt like exactly the right place to be, when the company of others who understood the particular weight of imperfect lives provided comfort that no amount of material prosperity could improve upon. The songs that once filled those rooms, now lost to us, except in fragments and echoes, carried within their melodies the accumulated wisdom of people who had learned to find beauty in circumstances that offered few obvious reasons for celebration. They sang not because their lives were easy, but because singing together made difficult lives bearable, because shared melody could transform individual struggles into communal strength, because the simple act of raising voices together created, however briefly, something larger and more meaningful than the sum of their separate anxieties. Even the great hall, with its abundance and ceremony, for all its luxury and privilege, served the same essential function, providing space for people to gather, to share food and drink and stories, to participate in rituals that connected their individual lives to larger patterns of meaning and significance. The silver goblets and imported wines, the elaborate entertainments and costly displays, were different expressions of the same fundamental human need that drew the tavern's patrons to their rough wooden tables and pewter tankards. All of these worlds, the tavern with its honest poverty, The great hall, with its magnificent abundance, the lost realm of forgotten songs and vanished customs, exists now primarily as stories, as memories preserved in archives and artifacts. It was the kind of historical curiosities that we can visit in imagination, but never truly inhabit. The specific challenges they faced, the particular forms their joys and sorrows took, the exact texture of their daily experience, all of this has passed into the realm of the irretrievable past. But the fundamental experiences they represent continue. We still gather with others to share food and conversation. We still seek communities where our imperfections are understood and accepted. We still use ritual and celebration to mark the passage of time and give shape to experiences that might otherwise seem random and meaningless. We still search for stories that help us understand our place in a world that often seems too large and complex for individual comprehension. The forms have changed dramatically. Our gathering places are brighter, our food more varied, our drinks safer and more reliable. The brutal uncertainties that shaped medieval life have been replaced by different kinds of challenges. Anxieties that would have been incomprehensible to Will and his companions, but that feel every bit as pressing to us as their concerns felt to them. We have gained much in comfort and security, but we have perhaps lost something in the intensity of community that necessity once created. In the depth of appreciation that scarcity could generate for simple pleasures, as you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself carrying with you some small portion of the wisdom that those medieval drinkers accumulated through their patient acceptance of limitation, their ability to find satisfaction in modest pleasures, their understanding that human community could flourish even in circumstances that offered few material comforts. They knew something about the art of being present in the moment, of extracting maximum warmth from minimum resources, of creating meaning through shared attention rather than individual achievement. The tavern still stands in that distant market town, though centuries have passed and the world around it has transformed beyond recognition. The building that once sheltered Will of the Broken Tankard now serves different purposes, welcomes different kinds of travelers, participates in economic and social systems that would seem like magic to its medieval inhabitants. But in quiet moments, when the light falls just so across its ancient timbers, visitors sometimes report a feeling of lingering warmth, as though the countless evenings of human fellowship that once filled those rooms had somehow soaked into the very stones and wood, creating a residue of comfort that time cannot entirely erase. Perhaps that is what we have been seeking in our journey tonight, not just historical knowledge or curiosity about the past, but some contact with that residue of human warmth, some reminder that people have always found ways to care for each other, to create beauty and meaning in the midst of struggle, to transform the simple act of being together into something approaching grace. The night air outside your window carries no trace of wood smoke or the sound of medieval voices raised in forgotten songs. The darkness beyond your walls holds no threat of the kind of cold and uncertainty that once made the tavern's warmth so precious. You rest in security and comfort that Will could never have imagined. Surrounded by technologies and conveniences that would have seemed miraculous to even the wealthiest medieval lord. Yet in settling into sleep, you participate in the same fundamental human ritual that has marked the end of day for countless generations. The gradual release of consciousness, the willing surrender to the mystery of rest and dreams, the trust that tomorrow will bring its own possibilities for connection and meaning, and the small satisfactions that make life worth living. Let your breathing slow to match the gentle rhythm that connected all those medieval sleepers. From the tavern drunk curled in his corner to the lord settling into his feather bed. From the serving maid finally released from her duties to the traveling merchant grateful for any safe place to rest. Let your mind release its hold on the day's concerns and drift into the same peaceful darkness that has welcomed human consciousness since the beginning of time. The stories we have shared tonight of Will and his quiet struggles, of songs lost and songs remembered, of the great feast and the humble alehouse, fade now into the background murmur of memory, becoming part of the vast library of human experience that each of us carries into sleep. They join the countless other stories of people who have loved and suffered and hoped and endured, who have found ways to be kind to each other despite the world's indifference, who have created moments of beauty and connection that shine like small lights in the darkness of historical time. Rest now, knowing that you are part of this continuing story. This endless human effort to find meaning and create community in a world that offers no guarantees except the certainty of change. Rest in the comfort of distance from medieval hardships, but also in the comfort of connection to medieval wisdom about the things that truly matter. Friendship, storytelling, the sharing of simple pleasures, the patient cultivation of whatever warmth and light we can create together in the face of life's essential uncertainties. The tavern sleeps, the great hall grows quiet, the songs fade into silence, and you, safe in your modern bed, surrounded by the accumulated comforts of centuries, can let yourself sink into the same peaceful darkness that has welcomed all the human family, knowing that tomorrow will bring new opportunities for connection, new chances to participate in the ancient art of being human together in a world that is always both harsh and beautiful, always demanding both courage and tenderness, always offering to those who know how to look for it. The possibility of grace discovered in the most ordinary moments of shared existence, knowing that you carry within you the same capacity for warmth and community that sustained will of the broken tankard and all his forgotten companions through their long nights of patient endurance and quiet joy. Sleep in peace, dreaming perhaps of voices raised together in songs we can no longer hear, but whose spirit continues in every gathering where people choose connection over isolation, understanding over judgment, shared humanity over the cold comfort of individual perfection. The night embraces you as it embraced them all, and in that embrace, the distance between their world and ours disappears into the deeper truth of what it means to be human, to seek comfort and meaning together, to rest at last in the ancient rhythm that connects all sleeping to all waking, all stories to all silence, all individual lives to the great continuing story of which we are all part. Good night.